Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today titled Maintaining Chapter Fiscal Integrity, Implementing Good Financial Practices, and Recognizing Red Flags at the Chapter Level. Today's webinar is going to be presented by Sean Carroll. In August of 2016, Sean was appointed as the Chief Procurement Officer for New York Office of General Services. Mr. Carroll manages more than 1,500 contracts with annual spend exceeding $26 billion and oversees New York Procurement Services Unit. He has been actively teaching at NIGP Forum and now travels the Northeast as an Area 1 chapter ambassador, helping chapters develop and thrive. So as we begin, if at any time during the webinar you need technical assistance, please let us know in the Q&A box. During the presentation, you may submit questions to the Q&A box as well on your screen. We will take them during specified parts of the presentation. So Sean, if you could please get us started.
Great, thank you, Jennifer, and welcome everybody. Thank you for participating. So we know we have a variety of folks registered for this session. Just to let you know, we're going to primarily focus on chapter fiscal integrity for NIGP chapters. So if you're already in a leadership position, coming into a leadership position, thinking about a leadership position, that's who this will be most useful for. But we're going to also talk about, generally, when you're running an organization, the kind of fiscal policies you should have in place. So you may be able to get value even if you're not in one of those roles. So we very much appreciate everybody joining us. Let me walk you through our content. What we're going to do is really talk about financial management basics first, and then we're going to talk about a little bit about the responsibility and accountability that goes along with these roles. We'll talk a little bit about separation of duties, some best practices, budgeting, and then once you are in one of these roles for a chapter, how you should be thinking about succession planning for maintaining that financial integrity from one set of leadership to the next. We're going to close with a set of what NIGP has identified as required documents and resources for chapters. And the goal there is to make sure that everybody is aware of the deadlines, aware of the best practices as part of chapter leadership. So we do have some built-in spots for questions. We welcome those, and certainly we'll be able to do questions at the end. I think we'll have plenty of time today. So, financial management basics. The first question when you go into a leadership role and it has financial responsibilities is, who are we financially? Who is our chapter? Do we, so what does the anatomy of our finances look like? And it starts with, what are our bank account numbers? Whose name are they in? What location are they what bank do we physically bank at? Who are the key contacts? Who are the signatories? And there should be some rules attached to each account. There should be limits on what you can spend out of the accounts and those sorts of things. So that's your very basic level financial hygiene. Now, in organizations that are really robust, what they have is all of this information put together, and there's sort of a training process and a passing of the torch from one financial manager to the next, from one chapter president to the next. But many of our chapters aren't always in that situation. Sometimes the transition isn't that smooth. So these are really the first things you have to get your hands on. In chapters that cover large geographic areas, there may be issues with which bank you have picked. Are there branches in all of the parts of the state or all of the parts of the region? So those are all sort of the very basic things. Then depending on your financial situation, you may also have a brokerage or an investment. And a lot of what that is to insulate your organization against an unforeseen financial issue. For example, several states and even at the national level have had conferences that have been negatively impacted by weather. Those things aren't normally part of an event's budget or a conference's budget. So you want to make sure that you have a way to insulate your organization against those. Again, if you're really small, You're really working on the day-to-day bills of getting around your region and building your chapter. But as you get bigger, there are opportunities to insulate your organization from those kind of financial stressors. One of the things to keep in mind is it's really important to do that the way not-for-profits do it. It's really important if you have cash, to put it in an investment, to have a policy around what that's for, rather than have it appear as if you're just profitable and almost playing with the definition of what a not-for-profit is. You may have a CPA firm, you may have somebody who does the organization's taxes. You probably have some insurance coverages. You'll have account information, again, key contacts for that. And you may have either a law firm or an internal auditor. So all of that is the very basic. It should be in one place. It should be easy for folks to transfer. If you're the financial person in charge of your chapter and you win the lottery, it should be very easy to pass to someone while you go on vacation. But those sorts of things are really where you need to start. Then, once you know who you are, then you have to decide what's important to you and how that plays out with your financial policies. So you want to think about your chapter's view on, do you charge people to come to an event? If you do, why? How much do you charge them? Because you have to strike a balance between being able to pay for the event and pay for the activities of your chapter versus having to attract people to events. So those are not things that just happen casually. They're things chapters make conscious decisions about, and it becomes very much a defining characteristic of who chapters are. If you have enough resources, you should probably have a board discussion of what your policy is on reserves. How much money is it okay to have on reserve? And at what point do you have enough money that it should be reinvested in the membership? And then what are the goals for the money we raise and spend? Is our goal purely education? Is our goal recruitment? Is our goal sort of maximizing the forward-facing presence, the accessibility of our chapter? And that'll determine whether you, as an organization, think about spending your money on your website, think about spending your money on in-person events or on NIGP chapter classes or resources to do education. So even before we talk about, the mechanics and the integrity of the process, this is really about who you are as a chapter and who you are, financially as a chapter. So that's why we wanted to start with that. We'll continue, just talk about how those philosophies become policies, right? So if you don't have policies in place, you may need them. You may also be small enough that right now you can, the board can agree on every year on how to manage your money. So don't feel like you have to over-administer this process if you're still a small organization. But these are some different policies that come out of that philosophical discussion of who you are, right? When we talk about check signing, check writing schedules, you guys can read through this whole list. I don't want to read the whole list to you. But things like what time of the year do you do your budget process? How long do you keep your receipts and copies of your receipts that of what your board spent money on? Do you have a financial statement schedule? What do you reimburse staff for, right? So certainly at NIGP and across governments, reimbursing people for things like alcohol is either a real challenge or it's not allowed at all. But it's really important to make sure that people who are making purchases, who are expecting reimbursements, understand those rules. They understand what will be reimbursed, what will not. And that is particularly important if you have things like events where people are fronting money for events. A lot of those things require approval in advance before you allow reimbursement. or may require approval in advance, but it's hugely important that you notify people about that and provide policies for that. So that's a key component, and we're going to continue to come back to what policies do you have in place. It'll come into play all the way through what we're talking about. But I think the takeaway is knowing who you are financially and then having policies to ensure it. Anytime you have a written policy, it's easier than trying to negotiate each individual financial transaction at the time it happens. It's just easier to have something the board has established that everybody is responsible for. And the board has to follow the policies too. So it's not a board policy that applies to the members, it's a board policy that also applies to the board, who will probably be doing most of the expenditures. One of the ones I want to make sure I highlight on here is credit card handling. For credit card handling, you really want to make sure you know who has a credit card and what they are allowed to spend money on. And this is really, no matter how big you are and how financially sound you are, if you have lots of resources, you want to make sure that people don't have unlimited credit card limits, because the opportunity for even accidental misuse is very high. If you're very small, having a credit, particularly if you're spread out across a large geographic area, having a credit card is a great way to do business, but you have to have a way to reconcile those bills and make sure that it's in accordance with the organization's philosophy. So we've put some spots in here for questions. We just gave you a lot of information about just sort of the underlying concepts of policies and financial integrity. So we thought we would stop there and then ask for questions. And once we're done with that, then we'll actually talk about the specifics about how you accomplish some of these things.
Thanks,
so
Sean.
Jennifer, do you have questions?
No, not yet. Yes. Do we have examples of budgets, or can we provide examples of budgets? Good question.
So that's a great question, and we very much appreciate it. And I think that the answer is twofold. First off, yes, certainly I can provide a limited source of that. One of the best places for that is to go onto Insight and to ask all of the folks who are managing chapters all over the country if they're willing to share sample budgets. For the most part, budgets don't contain confidential information. They shouldn't really contain people's names or people's information about reimbursements, and they should be a general overview. So Jennifer, if you can capture who that is, I'm happy to share some, but I would also encourage that person and everyone to post on Insight and to really get, to get 10 or 15 or 25 samples of different budgets. People do it different ways. We're going to talk a little bit about budgeting later, but you can do it on a, there's an accrual basis, on a cash basis. We'll talk about some of the differences. And if you get some samples from folks from Insight, you'll be able to put those next to each other. Jennifer, do you have any other samples available? Are there samples on the website?
No, we don't have samples of budgets, but we did get another question about sample policies of more basics like check signing, board reimbursement. And what I would suggest is on the NIGP website under chapter resources, Sean's actually going to go into this later of the slide. We actually have sample board policies that will have some of these basics in it. But what I'm also doing is paying these questions as good questions for us to ask chapters to share and for us to populate that chapter resource guide with these type of examples, so you're not reinventing the wheel, so you can see what a check signing or board reimbursement or credit card authorization policies look like.
That's great, and I think that would be exciting for everybody.
One other question that did come up is, does NIGP periodically audit review chapter bank accounts? NIGP does, Sean, and I'll answer that if that's okay. NIGP does not, but we do ask that you as chapters do audits. We suggest for your smaller chapters, anywhere from every 3 to 4 years, and for your large chapters, anywhere from 2 to 3 years. Do you have any information or comments about audits, Sean?
I would just add that, a lot of people sometimes when they see the word audit, they think that that's, to try to catch something that's bad. It's really, look, it's great if there is something not good going on, and audit is a great way to find that out. But an audit is a great way to have a third party come in and think about best practices and think about, what is working for you and what is not working for you. So yes, obviously NIGP recommends that you do it, but also when you look inside your chapter, it should be an exciting opportunity to strengthen your organization and know that you've got all of really good policies and procedures in place. So Jennifer, are we ready to move on to another section?
Sure, and again, for those people that are asking about those samples, check the resource guide, and that's going to be something as a takeaway from me. The person that did ask about example budgets did post in the Insight chapter leader community and didn't get anything. So I will do some more digging and get those posted, and then I'll let you know through Leaders in the Loop when we add some more content on the subject matter into that resource guide.
Great. And in the meantime, I'm happy to provide the sample budgets that I have access to. So
perfect. Thank you.
Sure. So I think, one of the things that's really important for us to talk about is the difference between responsibility and accountability. So responsibility is the formal role you play in financial management. You may be the chapter manager. You may be the chapter president. You may be the treasurer. You may have a formal role. Accountability is beyond a formal role. All of the members of a chapter, and particularly all of the folks that are in leadership roles, they probably have a role in providing oversight, checks and balances. And checks and balances are a critical component of a healthy financial system for any chapter. So this slide just gives you some ideas of the different ways a role may be responsible. So the treasurer very much, has a responsibility. The financial management, the day-to-day transactions, the development of the budget. It's probably the most robust role with responsibilities in the chapter. The president is right there with the treasurer. Usually they work together on putting the budget together, particularly if the president is helping to set priorities and the treasurer is providing that counterbalance of what those priorities are going to cost to execute. The president is responsible for making sure the right controls are in place and also making sure that the treasurer is not acting on their own. Right. So it's really important at that level of managing a chapter to balance that out. Then you see that the board is there, and the board typically approves the budget. They typically get a report every month of, how is the organization looking? How did money get spent? How did money get received? Are we on track, or do we see some concerns compared to our budget for the year? Then the membership is absolutely responsible for holding the board accountable, making sure that the money is being spent on education, not on board meetings, making sure that what they expect from their board are happening. So again, if you're a very small organization, you're probably a very tight-knit board. And you're very used to being friends and being together and working together. In many cases, not in all. But in those cases, you still have a responsibility to each other. So it's not really good enough to get comfortable enough with each other that you don't provide these checks and balances anymore. In a larger organization, it's easier to see these roles as formal, but it's also easier to put all of the burden on those folks that are in the formal roles. So you want to be really careful that the membership does not sort of give up all of their responsibilities to oversee the board also. Again, we're going to try to talk about the different sizes of organizations. If you have specific questions about the size of your organization and the balance there, we're happy to address those. But these are just some general guidelines. The smaller you are, the more you have to guard against familiarity and sort of an ease of management financially. And the larger you are, the more likely you are to go too formal and then allow people who aren't in formal roles with responsibility to not have or to not feel like they are empowered to have some oversight. So that's always the balance, and we want to make sure everybody thinks about that. So then fundamentals of a strong chapter management. This is actually the heart and soul of what you think about when you're doing your review of your organization and when you're implementing good strategies. We're going to go through each one of these, but some of them are directly connected to how you do your work. So as a procurement officer, integrity should be no surprise to anybody. The importance of that, how any apparent or actual lack of integrity negatively impacts your work organization, your chapter organization. So I think we're going to talk about integrity, but this should be something that we're very used to as procurement officers. Oversight and control is the same way. Inevitably, where you work, there are considerable checks and balances when you're spending money, when you're requisitioning for money versus when you're dispersing payments for bills. Then we also want to talk about timeliness, planning, and organization. And we're going to do each one of those just on a quick slide. So integrity, you really hopefully doesn't need a definition, but we're really talking about setting high standards for yourself, setting standards for the whole board, that these are just the natural expectations. The biggest way that you have integrity is you rely on everybody to be trustworthy, and then you double check that, right? Because integrity is about confidence in a person's natural reliability, natural ability to do the right thing. But you always also put a backstop procedure in to double check that. That's not questioning the person's integrity. That's having a system that has integrity all across it. So if you're very small, you may not have enough people to divide up all the financial duties. Ideally, so this goes to separation of duties. And the fourth bullet on that page is really relevant here. The person who reconciles the bills, approves them, checks them against the policy, authorizes the payments, and the person who has control over the accounts are ideally different people. The more overlap there is between the roles, the more oversight you need to reduce risks, such as errors, fraud, and theft. So let's be clear, once in a while, there is a bad actor. But most of the challenges around financial integrity in chapters come from errors. They come from simple things that are data entry errors, or they come from systems that were set up that the board got further and further away from naturally because they changed the kinds of services they were providing. So your board may have planned on how to reimburse people to go to a regional conference, but they may not have planned how to do that for periodic classes or periodic sessions that are done on a webinar. So your financial policy, you always have to look at it, see whether it remains appropriate, see whether it matches what you're doing. And it's really important for everybody to know that, yes, these policies are there to prevent fraud and theft, but they're really there to make sure that we're catching errors along the way. We're making sure that the day-to-day business that is done with an earnestness is still matching up to our policies, right? So you never want to scare people away and give them the impression that we believe they're dishonest. We don't believe people are generally dishonest. But we do believe that by having one person spend the money, one person confirm that the invoices match what we ordered, having one person look at, did it match the policy, right? That's the ideal. In most of your cases, you're not going to have enough board members, you're not going to have enough active financial overseers of the organization to do that. So try to alternate the roles. If you're reconciling the bills, don't do the next step. Do the, have someone else do the part where you're judging it as appropriate against the policy. Then go back and authorize the payment, but have somebody else control the accounts. So the more people in it, the better, but it does become cumbersome. It doesn't fit all chapters. But that back and forth, that try not ever to do the step you're responsible for and the next step that approves that action. And that's sort of the best place to start. So the example on the bottom sort of puts names to those roles. If the treasurer reconciles the bills, pays the bills, then the president of the board has to authorize the payment. May actually have to execute the payment and may have to issue the check. So those are the sorts of things that you need to keep in mind. Oversight and control. So integrity leads right up into oversight and control. If you develop and enforce strong internal controls, you should expect that your checks and balances are already naturally in place. So a great example is ensure accurate and complete financial reporting. Somebody comes back from a trip from doing a class and doesn't have a receipt. If you have a policy that says they have to have a receipt, that should be an opportunity to have that discussion. You shouldn't be able to reimburse that person without some unique action of the board or verification of their activities. Now, your board may have a little flexibility there. Your board may want to say, hey, if you're missing a receipt for something less than $10, as long as we know you were there and we know you did it, we're going to reimburse that. But we may have a cap on that flexibility, right? So please don't take any of these notes as absolutely hard lines. You have to run your organization the way your organization exists. If you're small, you have to be small, and you have to find a way to have these oversights in place. If you're large, you may have access to more money, which means you may need more formalized policies, more financial reporting, more periodic reporting. And the accuracy of these things also includes not only your financial records, but your tax returns. So we're going to talk about later and stress this again. One of the most important roles you have in a financial responsibility role in the chapter is your tax returns, because your tax returns identify you as a not-for-profit. They identify you as an organization very clearly. Without those tax returns, particularly if you don't file them more than 1 year in a row, you run the risk of jeopardizing your status as an NIGP chapter, as an organization, and you run the risk of the IRS looking to see where the financial transactions were that were going on. So much less painful to file the tax returns than it is to go through the process of not filing them and possibly losing your not-for-profit status or your NIGP chapter status. So regularly assess risks. A lot of people think and talk about risk as if risk is always bad. The reality is risk is just actions that have ramifications. So sometimes the risk is we could be out $10 because we overpaid a receipt. Sometimes the risk is we really don't have a lot of money, and if we don't watch it carefully, we may not be able to provide our members with the right education. We may not be able to provide our members with the things we've promised them this year. So when we think about how risk should be mitigated, if you're very close financially, you may want to think about other ways to increase your revenue, whether it be NIGP classes or any other chapter resources, right? And talk to each other about ways to raise dollars as a chapter. But if you have a lot of dollars, you really want to think about the risk of, if you have $1,000 credit card limit, that means that your loss at any one given point could be $1,000. So you want to think about how do you mitigate that? What happens when you start getting to those larger dollar transactions? And how do you make sure that you feel really great about those when they're finished? We've already talked about this a little bit, have the organization's financials audited. you should have a discussion inside your board. Do you have the money for an audit? How often do you have the money for an audit? You may have to budget it for a couple of years in a row in order to have the money to do it. But it is so worth it, right? Anybody who is an incoming leader for your chapter is going to know that the current leadership did good stewardship of the financials. The membership is going to have an easy way to understand that the chapter leadership is managing the dollars properly. So you can see where those financials being audited really, they help brand your organization as one that is fiscally solvent. A lot of times when you're doing recruitment or you're going to events, you always want to make sure that in addition to being fiscally solvent, that you give that impression of financial stability. It'll allow members to feel credible coming to the organization, to not worry about being associated. It'll allow your vendors to want to continue to do business with you, your locations, your hotels, or wherever you're doing your events. So that's oversight and control. This is a screenshot of something that's on the NIGP website. I'm going to show you where near the end of the presentation. It's an internal control checklist. This is not the entire document. It's 4 or 6 pages long. But this is a real sort of, think about it like going to the doctor when you're well. This allows you to go into your chapter, have your board say yes, no, or not applicable to all of these things. One best practice is to take this survey and review it and fill this out as a board every year. Ideally, all of the boxes get checked yes, and you have a very successful operation. But in case you don't, this is sort of a thumbnail roadmap for how you can be even more financially secure going forward. So please consider using that. That's why NIGP drafts resources like this. On timeliness, right? Timely financial reports. Okay, so it matters a lot to your credibility if your financial reports are due in March. It matters that they get produced in March. It matters that you file your taxes on time. And it really matters that if you're doing quarterly or monthly updates on your budget, that those happen regularly. And the reason that is you run the risk of, if there is a problem, you want to catch it when it is small. You want to catch it when it is happening, not 6 months later or a year later. So particularly, we know how busy everybody is, right? We know that being part of an NIGP chapter is part of your professional development, but it's also part of your job. You go to work every day as well. So you don't need to make your financial reports 300 pages long and make them over bureaucratized. They should be long enough to show how the organization is doing, how are our checks and balances working, and long enough and detailed enough for the board and the membership to ask questions if they have any, right? So small chapters, you may be doing paper-based record keeping. You may have a folder with receipts in it, with a form that identifies who you reimbursed, with a copy of the check. That's okay, right? You don't have to feel the burden to do this all technologically. As you get larger, you may realize that, and so I'm brand non-specific, but one idea is things like QuickBooks, things like doing a quarterly financial report to the board, those sorts of things. And you want to think about it in the same way that, if you're a small town or a small village, at your at the town board meeting, they probably report on every financial transaction. At a state level, they probably report on the general status of those budget accounts and make the details available to people if they have questions. So it's the same as what we do for work about running our chapter, but sometimes we don't always relate those two things. So it was important to say, and we wanted to share that. Then we go to planning. Planning really is about a budget. And a budget really is about trying to get as close as you can to a good guess. So, one of the critical components here is not just balanced budget, but a reasonable balanced budget. So the way that happens is if you had regular expenses last year, they may be the same or proportionally the same this year. If you had standard revenue last year, budgeting for double that revenue without a new plan on how to raise that revenue is not consistent with normal budgeting or with really prudent budgeting. Planning is, it's a key tool for managing the present financial state. So sometimes if a budget line, if you budgeted $1,000 and now there's a $5,000 invoice in that line, it may be as simple as it was booked in the wrong place, but your budget may also have underestimated or overestimated a cost. That is a fast way to find a first red flag. So a good plan with a good budget gives you that line of sight that when something doesn't look correct, it's easy to see and easy to react to. So we talked about estimating. We talked, it's always good to use last year's budget, but then you want to think about what you're changing before you go down that road. And then the temptation to wing estimates or be overly optimistic. Right, this is not the place for that. When we get up and we talk about how excited we are for the new year and we're going to have 1,000 people come to our event, that's different than what we do when we budget. When we budget, we always try to over imagine our expenses and under imagine our revenue. That way, if we're surprised in either place, it can only be good for the budget and good for the organization. And then organization. So, and this is certainly my first year as a chapter treasurer, this is something I struggled with. Organization is something where everything you have to do should go on a calendar. What day of the month do you have to pay the credit card bills? What day of the month is the board meeting, and how far in advance of the board meeting are the financials due? It is absolutely easier to do financials for a chapter, particularly as the chapter gets bigger, if you do them when the expenses come in, instead of trying to reconcile them monthly or quarterly. It can seem very daunting if you're not doing it all the way along. Easy to recreate. The reason we put this on here is we've all had technical problems. We've all had a computer fail on us. It's really important that more than one person have a backup copy of the financial statements, the financial records, the current year's receipts and invoices. It's great to save all of these things using a technology. But if you're, either use a shared environment or make sure at every board meeting, if you're the treasurer, make sure the president has a copy of all the documents. Or put where appropriate, where they're not confidential, put them into an email so that you always have the ability to get back to them. Easy to trace, so it should, the ideal situation is you go in, there was an expense and the invoice and the payment match exactly. So when you have one activity going on and you wrote one check and it had to go and then be dispersed out, every time you add a permutation to it, every time it is not just straight across the line matching, it's going to be more difficult to trace the dollars and more difficult to identify errors or red flags. And then reimburse quickly. This is more about, so it's actually, if you're doing investments, it's better for you to hold on to your money for a while, but it's not better for your organization. Most of us are not dealing with the kinds of dollar amounts where collecting the interest is more important than the wellness of our volunteers feeling appreciated, feeling like they have done good work and have been reimbursed as promised. So this is really a way to use your financial policies to invest in your members. It's really not about managing the dollars, although it is helpful to make sure as you approach the end of the year that you're not playing catch up on reimbursements. It's also really important to have people submit their reimbursements in a timely fashion. If they don't do that, they are way more likely to lose the context for their trip, the context for their receipts, or the documents that will allow them to be reimbursed. And then budgeting, I added this back in again. This is a roadmap. It's a key tool for getting everybody to agree on what your group will do, what they won't do in the coming year. It's a critical management tool to understand gaps in the budget. And you see, I continue to repeat this. The unexplained variances in the budget may be your first red flag, right? So your budget is a management tool, it's a policy tool, it's a chapter tool, but it's also a financial backstop against seeing what's happening. Again, you can do things on a fiscal year or a calendar year basis, and your organization can set that up. Calendar year is the most natural, right? It's natural to go from January to December. But if you have a big event in December, you may want to consider shifting your fiscal year so that you can pay all the bills from that event before you close your fiscal year. Cash or accrual basis, you want to think about whether bills roll into the next year. If you pay a bill in the next year, is it 2019's cash or 2020's cash? And this will matter when you do your financial statements and your taxes. It may be a complicated subject. Nobody on your board may have had experience making that decision, in which case, reach out to your chapter ambassadors, reach out to NIGP, go to Insight, take advantage of the resources of the infinite number of chapters across the country that are dealing with these issues. And that, so that then tacks on the money that bridges from one year to another. But we're all used to that, right? When government budgets change over year, typically there is a procedure for what bills have to be closed out, what bills can roll forward, how that works, how that gets managed. So again, don't leave behind what you have such vast experience in as procurement officers. Bring that to your chapter, because you already have most of these things. And we've already talked about access to sample budgets and making that available. But this is just an image of one that I grabbed. This just, in this budget, we had identified account numbers. We had described the account. Each account had a line description. Everything had a number. So every time money came in, every time money came out, it was automatically associated with these numbers. And then we would report out, where are we on dues? Have we hit our $25,000 in dues this year? Where are we on travel for the board members? Where are we on equipment? And before anybody panics, this is a budget for a very large chapter. So you're going to see big numbers on these pages. Remember, nobody expects you to have that much money if you're a small chapter. We just expect you to have a plan and be able to very simply see what you're expecting your money to be and how that, and this is a very natural way to see what happens when your expectations are not met. So that is an awful lot of information, and we're sorry that we only put questions a couple of times. But with that much information out there, do folks have questions? Do people want to interact on any of that information?
Yes, we do have a question. Is there an average amount the chapters typically should keep as a reserve?
So again, you want to manage your chapter about who they are, not to other people's standards. So if you have very big events, some big chapters put enough money to cover all of the costs of one of their big conferences in reserve. That would mean that if one conference got wiped out for weather or got canceled or had any other number of issues happen to it, the organization wouldn't have to use its operating money to address that. So a small chapter might consider keeping 20% in reserve that just helps you deal with the little unexpected costs. A larger chapter may consider even keeping more than that. They may consider keeping 50%. But you do get to a point where if the risk is not real, and you're really never going to need, to panic and use 50% more than your budget, that is money that could be used for education. That is money that could be used for member recruitment and to grow your chapter. So that's the balance. And that's why we started with, what is your philosophy? If your philosophy is secure your organization against those risks and you have the resources to do it, put that money aside. But if you're putting that money aside at the expense of growing your chapter, that's a board decision you have to make, and you may be being too conservative. So I would love to just tell you, yes, everybody should have 20% in reserve. If you have 20% in reserve, you're probably dealing with any day-to-day surprises really well. If you have more than that in reserve, you really should have a policy in place about why that money is in reserve and what it's for. And if it's in reserve, does it have to be in reserve in cash? Or could it be in an investment account? Could it be furthering the purpose of education while it sits there? So hopefully that makes sense to folks. And if there's follow-up questions, we're happy to answer.
Follow up to that. They asked 20% of what number? What are you basing that 20% on?
So it's really about what your total expenditure is going to be, right? So you can't put 20% of your revenue in, because then your revenue won't be high enough to cover your basic costs. But when you look at your expenses, you could book an expense for depositing an extra $100 a month or depositing an extra $1,000 a year into an account until you had, so if your organization spent $10,000 last year, 20% would eventually be $2,000. But you could put that together $200 at a time until you had it put together. You don't have to put it all together. Reserves are really a goal. How fast can you get there? What you don't want to do is, out of a $10,000 budget, not recruit people and not educate because you put $5,000 of, $5,000 of what you thought you were going to spend into a reserve account, because it cuts down on what you can spend. I hope that answers the question. It feels a little bit muddled. I feel like I would want to draw it. But I think that's what you want to think about. Could you associate it with revenue? Sure, but make sure that your revenue is high enough that you're covering your expenses first.
Sean, we have 4 more questions. Do you want to do them now, or do you want to hold these till the end?
Why don't we take one more at least, and because that way they don't stack up too badly.
Sure. Let me ask you another. When hosting an event, is it worth it to purchase event insurance in the event of severe weather or any unforeseen circumstances?
So in true government form, sometimes. So I think, if your organization has the money to invest and you're hosting a half-day class, there's no travel, there's not a lot of details, and you happen to be where I'm from in the Northeast or anywhere in the northern part of the country, and it's procurement month and it's March, there's a real possibility your event is going to get canceled. But if your event was only going to cost $300 and it wasn't going to negatively affect your budget, it may not be worth it. So event insurance is really about, as the event gets so big that if you had a problem hosting the event, it would negatively affect the whole chapter, then you start getting into those dollars become worth it. Where that line is never at over $1,000 you have to do insurance, or you should do insurance. Because over $1,000 may not be the threshold for your chapter. So what you want to do is look at, if all the bills for this event came true and none of the revenue came true, is this event something we could afford to lose, or is it something we have to insure? I don't know how to ask if that makes sense through this forum, but hopefully that makes sense. And if it doesn't, please ask a follow-up question.
Okay, well, let's hold off on the other 3 to the end. I'm keeping a list of them, and let's get through the rest of the presentation, and then we'll do more questions at the end, Sean.
Sounds great to me. So the last couple of things we've got are just real quickly, succession planning, chapter financial handbook. There is one on the NIGP website, but you really want to start thinking about, have a book, a flash drive, a set of files that is who you are financially, what decisions the board has made, why they've made them, and how that has been implemented. Because you always want to be able to pass that on to the next person or train them on it while you're there. That's actually the best plan. The best plan is, while someone is treasurer and while someone is president, pick someone else to train about the financials. Start getting them involved. Start getting them excited about that. Some chapters, when they have a new treasurer, they have a time built into that transition where what you do is transition all of those accounts. Again, as an example, first time I became the treasurer of an NIGP chapter, I had to drive to the bank that the former treasurer had set the account up at in order to change the accounts. New York State is a very large state, so the logistics of that were considerable. So you have to plan for that. You have to have a plan to train people on the philosophy and the mechanics, but there's also an operational issue depending on how big your chapter is and where your banks are and where your financial records are. You may actually need to physically get together and transition that banking. And then recruiting the next financial managers, you're looking for people who come with that integrity, who come with those organizational skills, or are very willing to learn those organizational skills. And you're looking to develop those people and get them excited about why financial management is important to your chapters. So then NIGP resources. So everything else beyond this is all screenshots from NIGP. So I want to go through this slide. We may come back to some of these items a second time. NIGP has paperwork that is required of all chapters. I'm going to spend the most time on that. And the second item, which is NIGP chapters must fill out their taxes annually. Then you have to keep your leadership information up to date. So many of you may be in your chapter's leadership. We may not know that because those new chapter information forms may not have been filed with us yet. So we don't actually know how many treasurers we have on the call. We know some of you, but we don't know everybody. Then we have a section dedicated to forms processes on the website. Chapter ambassadors, in a shameless plug for the chapter ambassador program, we really are willing to help. Who your chapter ambassador is set up by region, and those regions are all on the website. So if you don't know who your chapter ambassadors are, please take that opportunity to look. They can be one of your direct lines of contact to NIGP for this kind of stuff. And then again, leverage each other. You won't always get responses, but insight is always worth asking for. Just be careful that your fellow chapters are not considered legal advice, right? So don't be very wary of where you start going down those roads. You very much want to consider, do you need an attorney? Do you need an accountant? But your chapters can share experiences with you, good ideas with you, and best practices with you. So always worth using Insight for that. So real quickly, this is a screenshot of the website. It's under the heading of Connect with Chapters. And you can see that it's laid out very much the way the last slide was. There's annual reporting forms, ideas for how to raise revenue, and programs that we run to help you support that. Other NIGP resources, good financial management information, and so on down the slide. So this is probably the most important part. These are your annual reporting forms. This is what happens if you click that box. So this is your summary. You can see chapter leadership. We've already talked about that. Chapter member data form. We'd love to know how you're growing, how you're doing. Is your chapter thriving? Is it struggling with something? Chapter financial form, your group exemption update form, all of those things, right? You literally click each link, it'll bring you to the forms and it'll walk you through how you fill them out. Due May 15th or November 15th. I promised Jennifer I would say pay your taxes multiple times during this presentation. So your 990 or your 990N, you need to file it and you need to email it to the NIGP chapters. To the website that's there for NIGP. because we need also to have that on record. Part of that is so we know who you are and who's financially responsible for the organization. The other part is because you're part of our brand, and we really want to make sure that if this is not getting done at your chapter level, we want to remind you of the risks and ramifications of that. And then there's a chapter seminar agreement and an opportunity to upload your chapter roster. Jennifer, I'm just stopping for 1 second. Is there anything big on here that I'm missing?
No, you captured everything.
Okay. So I'll just run through the other screenshots real quickly. Under financial management, you can see there are sample financial documents there. We're going to talk again about whether we add sample budgets or whether there are other documents we should be putting together. And then general documents. These are your IRS 990s, your chapter insurance forms. There's sort of a presentation there on legal and tax issues for nonprofits. So really keep up to date with those and know that this link, this Connect with Chapters link, in addition to, you can see at the top where it says Area 9, that's how you find your chapter ambassadors. But this link really is for your guidance. Where so many things NIGP does is about you at work. All of these links are about you in your chapter, right? So instead of just procurement education, this is really how you operate a chapter and how you become greatly successful at that. There you go. That's my information. We're going to leave that up for as long as we stay on the line. I'm happy to take additional questions. We're happy to take additional questions. And Jennifer, if you've got some, we'll answer as many as we can while we're here.
I do. Do you think most chapters have a credit card, or do most chapters have officers purchasing items and then getting reimbursements?
So I think a lot of chapters are moving towards having a credit card. Most of them are doing it through their bank, I believe. And some chapters are hesitant to do it because when you accept that responsibility, you're accepting personal responsibility for the use or misuse of that card. So not all chapters have boards that want to do that. There's costs both ways. If you're using a P card or some version of a purchase card, you should have real good controls over it, but it'll allow you to pay your bills faster, and most vendors now take purchase card. On the other side, the paper process has the process being a little slower. Which is good and bad. You have the ability to look at it and look at the spend a little more clearly, but not all of your vendors are going to take check anymore. And depending on how you're expediting your stuff, you may eventually need a P card. So I think most are using some version of a card. I understand why some are not, and there's no right or wrong. You just have to make the decision for yourself.
And I would also add, Sean, to that those who are using credit cards, to make sure you have that policy in writing in a policy manual for the chapters, that you have something to follow.
Absolutely.
Next question, board travel. Do chapters provide reimbursement for this?
I think where chapters are very, very large, I think they do. I think the general consensus is that board members tend to be making a very large investment of time and energy and resources into the organization. So to ask them to travel and pay for their own travel is often a challenge. I could tell you that very small organizations often are so committed that the small board that tends to do a lot of the functions probably are investing their own money. They're probably not getting reimbursed for all of that because they're trying to stabilize the finances of the organization. But I can tell you that as you get bigger, and certainly as your chapter geographically gets bigger, there's a lot more reason to reimburse. So it's really important before you start doing that to have a policy, because you never want to just have a board member sort of have an imbalance where they're getting reimbursed for lots of things and it's not transparent to the membership.
Do chapters do ITBs, RFPs for auditing services?
So you're not required, to, because you're not governed by government procurement rules, right? So your chapter can set up your own procurement rules. However, this is what we do for a living. So in most cases, I think chapters gravitate to what we know. What we know is there should be competition between vendors in order to get, in order to establish a vendor at work and in order to establish a vendor for our chapter. Is that always going to be true? Do you have more flexibility as a chapter? Yes. But I think chapters absolutely do. And I think there are sample RFPs, particularly for auditing firms that are out there. I certainly have a few that I'm willing to share. And I'm positive that folks on the phone have others. I think they're primarily RFPs, though, at least in the common way that people understand the difference between RFPs and IFPs.
Great. We still have some time, so if anybody has any other questions, please post them to the Q&A box. I did have somebody that made a statement, and they said they recommended creating Gmails for each position that can be passed along to the next member. You can save all your files and contacts to the Google Drive, easiest document transition you can make. So that was a recommendation from someone.
I think that that's a great addition, and I think it's probably something that'll make this presentation in the future. So thank you, whoever did that. We very much appreciate that, and I think that's great advice.
So I don't see any other questions here. Sean, do you have anything that you want to wrap up with and close with for us?
No, just I think the biggest thing is, particularly if you're new to chapter leadership, depending on how the transition to you went of your financials, this may feel overwhelming at sometimes. So one of the values of NIGP is to be able to have somebody to lean on, or hundreds of somebody to lean on if you're going through Insight. So remember, as procurement officers, you have very strong gut instincts. You can see when something doesn't look right. If you apply that to your financials and you have questions, leverage NIGP, leverage the resources you have, and never be afraid to say, hey, I'm not sure this is right. I at least need an explanation. If that's your fallback position always, you will almost always be successful.
And I'll close too with just seeing what I see in the chapter world. I know it can be a lot of effort on the front end, but to take the time we talked about that calendar of events. I've seen chapters actually do by month. This is what each position, not just the treasurer, but the president should be doing each month. And having those kind of documents that you pass down for that new officers that come in is priceless. It allows those new people to come in and look at a document or a binder to say, I know exactly what I'm supposed to be doing and when. It doesn't seem so overwhelming when you think about all the roles and responsibilities. If somebody handed that to you, it certainly will make you feel more comfortable coming into that new role. So I highly encourage, if you don't have a policy and procedure manual for any of your officer positions, to put those together, as we do have samples, as Sean showed in our resource guide. And we can certainly provide more for you as well. With
and
that,
just to add,
sure, Sean.
Sorry, just to add to that, Jennifer, if you're passed a great document, there is some expectation that you will add to it, add value to it, and pass it on again. So if you're in an organization that is very well organized, please take good care of that organization and pass it on to the person behind you with the same sort of earnestness that it was passed on to you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Sean. I appreciate your time today. I hope that everybody enjoyed our webinar. Please take time to fill out the evaluation survey. A link containing the survey and recording of this webinar will be emailed to everyone tomorrow. Some details that we talked about as adding some resources to the on-site resource library. I will work to find samples, and then I will let you know through our Leaders in the Loop that goes out to our chapter leaders when we've added some new documents to that. So thank you again, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.